When my son told me I would not be welcome at his home for Thanksgiving, I laughed at first, thinking he was joking. Then I saw his face. No smile, no warmth, just cold certainty. My own child. The boy I raised with every ounce of strength I had. The boy whose college tuition I worked double shifts to cover, stood in front of me and said, "Dad, it's better if you don't come this year." Had. The words struck harder than any fist. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened. My throat closed. And I stared at him like he had turned into a stranger. Better if I don't come? To the holiday I'd hosted for 3 decades? To the table I built with my bare hands? The one his mother polished every year until it gleamed like sunlight? I looked past him into the living room, at the furniture I had paid for when he and his wife insisted they needed a bigger house. I saw the chandelier hanging over the dining room, one I had bought after cashing out a retirement account. Every corner of that home was touched by my sacrifice. Yet there I stood, an outsider. He shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking to the ground. Laura's parents are visiting. And they prefer a certain atmosphere. It's just easier if you're not here. Easier. That was the word he chose. As if my presence was a burden, an inconvenience. I felt heat crawl up my neck. Not from anger at first, but from humiliation so sharp it burned. I had given everything, my savings, my time, my health to see my son stand tall. And now he asked me to shrink, to disappear, so his wife's family could sit comfortably at a table I built. I nodded slowly, forcing the corners of my mouth into something that must have looked like a smile. "I understand," I whispered, though nothing inside me understood. As I walked back to my truck, the autumn air felt heavier than stone. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. My son had just told me that his life, his holidays, his happiness, no longer had room for me. And in that moment, I knew something inside me had broken. I did not always feel like a stranger. There was a time the house smelled like orange cleaner and Sunday roast, and my son slid across the kitchen in white socks. I knew where I belonged. Elaine and I raised him in a narrow brick house in Dearborn. A leaning fence, a maple that dropped helicopters each spring. I built his first bed from scrap oak. He fell asleep holding a warm rail. In the morning, I found my name in crayon on the footboard. Dad. Spelled like a crown. I worked with wood and with people who did not mind splinters. We framed basements and rebuilt porches that had given up under Michigan winters. Some nights I limped home and left a trail of sawdust to the sink. Elaine handed me a towel and said I smelled like pine. We never had much, but neighbors came without knocking. It felt like wealth. When Noah got into college, I took overtime. I ate from a cooler and skipped vacations. He needed books. On move-in day, we hauled boxes up a cement stairwell. I cried where he could not see me, near the ramp where the city lights start. Laura came later. Careful hair, a voice that sounded grated. She smiled at me quickly, like a hostess seating a stranger. Her parents, the Whitakers, wore winter like an accessory. They asked about my work with the smile people learn at fundraisers. I answered with the truth. I build things that last. The wedding was bright, and I paid what I could. Not because anyone asked, because that is what fathers do when they want joy to settle in deep. I settled a late invoice. I fixed a speaker so the vows could be heard. I pressed an envelope into Noah's palm and said nothing about the number inside. They bought a condo near Royal Oak, and I brought my tools. We turned a cramped kitchen into something warm. Laura approved of the backsplash after I changed it twice. We ate pizza on the floor while the counters cured. After Elaine died, the house was too quiet. Grief shifts the floorboards and takes a chair at the table and waits. I fixed neighbors' steps, winterized windows, and met Noah for coffee when he remembered to text. He often paid with the card I had given him for emergencies. When they outgrew the condo, I said yes before they finished the question. A banker slid papers across a polished desk and talked about equity like a neighbor who always opened the door. I signed where he pointed. I took a second loan because the inspector found things that could not wait. Movers bumped a dresser into a new life. That night I stood in their empty living room and pictured grandchildren chasing light across a hardwood floor I could not afford for myself. I kept saying yes when the refrigerator died in July, when the furnace coughed in January, when Laura wanted a longer table for her family. I sanded the top until it felt like glass. I pictured small hands dropping peas and learning to laugh at the sound. There were changes I did not name. Noah stopped lingering on the porch after I finished a job. Laura's messages began with need instead of hello. At dinners, the talk shifted to museums I could not pronounce, and trips that needed someone to watch the dog. Her father asked whether I had thought about retiring. The first time, Laura said atmosphere. I thought she meant candles. Later I learned it meant me. Still, there were good days. A Saturday when we built shelves and Noah whistled a Little League tune. Then the thanks grew shorter. Then they stopped landing. I tried to speak the old language. I brought chili when the snow came early. I fixed the door that caught on a nail and made a small complaint each time it closed. I left early so they could rest. On the drive home, I told Elaine about it. Out loud. Like a man across from an empty chair. I said our boy was fine. I said he was happy. I said it again. When the first holiday at their new place arrived, I wore the good shirt Elaine loved. I brought the recipe card with her handwriting leaning uphill. I carried in the roasting pan like a family heirloom. Laura met me at the door with a smile that did not reach the corners. The Whitakers were already seated. Someone had lit a candle that smelled like clean money. I set the pan down and understood I had been invited to cook, not to belong. I told myself it was a mix-up. People forget the hands that built the room. I stayed until the dishes were done and left while the coffee was being poured. On the porch, my breath came in pale clouds. Noah put a hand on my shoulder and said he would call tomorrow. He did not. The silence learned my address and came often. I held on to the older rooms anyway, the boy with sawdust on his sleeves. The first apartment smell of laundry soap and new paint. His laughter under a pizza sign after a game they lost by 10. Those were the blueprints of my life. I walked them at night. Even when the lights at his house were on for people who never knew what a door costs, when you build it from nothing. The first hints of distance arrived quietly, like drafts through a cracked window. At first I ignored them, convincing myself every family shifts with time. But soon, the signs were too sharp to dismiss. Laura's parents always spoke in a polished tone, as if every word had been measured. They mentioned ski trips in Vermont and wine tastings in Napa. When I joined the conversation, I talked about the jobs I finished that week. The porches I rebuilt. The storm doors I hung before winter. Their smiles froze. Then they glanced at one another. The way people do when they decide something without speaking. Noah began echoing them. Not in words, but in posture. His shoulders tightened when I spoke. He laughed too quickly at his father-in-law's stories and brushed past my own. I noticed how Laura's mother praised him for his potential. How her father slipped him advice about investments I knew he could not afford. And when I spoke of saving, of caution, Noah shifted in his seat, as if my words embarrassed him. At Thanksgiving 2 years ago, Laura arranged the seating chart. I found my name card at the far end of the table, next to the kitchen door. Each time it swung open, a blast of cold air touched my back. The Whitakers sat in the center, wine glasses raised, voices filling the room. Noah was between them, glowing under their approval. When I caught his eye, he looked away. as though my presence reminded him of something small he wanted to forget. It was not always cruel. Sometimes it was subtle. Invitations that arrived late, conversations I joined only to realize they had finished without me. Once, when I brought a bottle of bourbon saved from a trip years ago, Laura thanked me politely and slid it aside, replacing it with her father's preferred brand. No one poured mine. There were words too, sharper than gestures. One evening, after I replaced their broken garage door opener, Laura said, "It's a relief to have family help. It saves us from calling a handyman." I stood there with the remote in my hand, realizing she did not see me as family at all. She saw me as free labor. Noah kissed her cheek and said nothing. The nights after those gatherings were the hardest. I drove home through quiet streets, headlights painting long shadows on the asphalt. I spoke to Elaine's picture on the dashboard, asking if she saw what was happening. She had been the bridge, the one who softened sharp edges. Without her, my voice sounded too loud in the silence. One Christmas, I brought the old tree skirt she had sewn when Noah was 5. It was faded but still carried the scent of cinnamon she sprinkled every December. Laura looked at it briefly, then folded it back into the box. She said, "We're going for a more modern theme this year." The skirt never came out again. I began to notice how often the Whitakers were in their home, how easily they moved through the rooms. They rearranged furniture, offered advice on decor, and criticized things I had built. Once, when her father ran a hand along the stair rail I had carved, he said, "This will do for now, until you can afford something proper." Noah chuckled nervously. I stood still, heat rising under my collar, gripping the edge of my chair to keep from responding. The divide widened. My visits became shorter, my repairs more frequent but less acknowledged. Noah rarely called just to talk. When he did, it was about bills, insurance, or emergencies. I told myself it was life, that young couples need space. Yet the truth pressed against me every night. I was no longer seen as a father, but as a resource. The last thread snapped the day Laura dismissed the story of Noah's first baseball game. I had told it many times. About the home run he nearly hit. About the way he beamed when Elaine lifted him onto her shoulders. Laura smiled thinly and said, "We've all heard that one before." The table laughed lightly. Noah did not defend me. He took another bite of his meal, as if the story had never mattered. I drove home that night with my hands trembling on the steering wheel. For the first time, I admitted it aloud in the empty cab of my truck. I was being erased, piece by piece, memory by memory. They were pushing me outside the walls I had built with my own hands. The week before Thanksgiving, Noah called while I was sanding a maple stair tread in the garage. Sawdust drifted like pale snow. He cleared his throat. That was always the sign something heavy was coming. "Dad." "About Thursday," he said. "Laura's parents are hosting at our place. Colleagues too. It will be small, quiet. You know how they are." He paused. "It might be better if you sit this one out." I stared at a scar in the wood. The grain curved like a river that had changed course. "We can do something the weekend after," he added. "Leftovers. Maybe the lake." "It will be the same." "It will not be the same," I said. "Your mother's recipe is already on the counter. She always used too much sage. You know that." "Dad, please." Laura is worried about the atmosphere. Her parents prefer a certain kind of conversation. "Comfort," I said. I looked at my pegboard. The worn hammer. The square Elaine bought when we could not afford it. None of it looked like comfort. It looked like work. It looked like love. "I will drop off the pie and the cranberries in the morning," I said. "You can tell them you made the pie if that helps." On Thanksgiving morning, I woke before light. I rolled the crust the way Elaine taught me. I packed the pie and sauce into a cooler and drove across town in a pale sun. Their house wore a wreath. I walked up the path with the cooler in one hand and the old roasting pan in the other. The pan still wore the scratches of 100 holidays. Laura opened the door before I knocked. Behind her, the table stretched long. The Whitakers stood at the island. Her mother adjusted a place card. Her father read a wine label. "You came early," Laura said. "Thank you for the pie." She reached for the cooler but not for the pan. "I brought the pan because this is the one we always used," I said. "It keeps the turkey moist." "We are trying something new," she said. "A heritage turkey. Already in the oven." The chef left instructions. I set the cooler on the counter. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and lemon. It did not smell like home. Noah came from the back hallway, tucking his shirt. He smiled and then adjusted the smile so it matched the room. "Hey, Dad. You did not have to bring all this. Mom would have wanted you to rest. Your mother would have wanted the house full," I said, elbows on the table. A gravy boat that dripped and nobody cared. Laura's mother approached. "You must be Noah's father. We are grateful you could drop the food. We have a full house. 12 place settings, just family and close friends." I looked at the table. Name cards with looping letters. I did not see mine. I looked at Noah. He stared at the tile. Laura's father spoke softly. "I hear you build things. Practical work. We were discussing updates. Contractors will come through. Raise the worth. Good for resale." I set the pan down. The metal rang a soft note. I wanted to say I had rebuilt the baseboards and sistered joists after a sag the inspector missed. I wanted to say I had saved them $3,000 and a burst pipe. Instead, I said, "That makes sense." Laura touched my elbow and guided me toward the door. "We should let you get going so we can finish. The caterers are bringing the sides. Noah will stop by later with a plate." "A plate," I repeated. The word felt small. It felt like apology wrapped in foil. "Dad," Noah said, "we will make time this weekend. We can watch the game. We can talk." I set the pie on the counter and left the sauce. I picked up the roasting pan. I could not leave it. It had known the weight of our life. As I reached the door, the first guests arrived. Quiet laughter. They looked past me into the bright interior. Laura's mother said, "Welcome to the family." I stood on the mat with my pan and waited for someone to say my name. No one did. Outside, the cold bit a line across my throat. I walked slowly to the truck so I would not drop the pan. Halfway down the path, Noah called after me. "Dad." I kept walking because I had no safe place to put the pan if I turned back. In the cab, I set the pan on the passenger seat and stared at it. A scratch near the handle looked like a lake from above. I saw Elaine's hands there. I saw Noah at 7. I placed my palm over the scratch and closed my eyes. My phone buzzed. A text from Noah arrived. "Thank you for dropping things off. We love you. It will be easier this way." I read it twice. "Easier," I whispered. I drove to the river and parked under a bare tree. I watched families carry foil pans toward warm doors. A window opened and spilled laughter into the cold. When the sun began to fall, I drove home. I opened a can of soup I did not taste. I washed the pan and set it to dry. I laid Elaine's recipe card on the counter and pressed my thumb against the smudge where her hand always rested. The smudge did not move. That night I pulled a chair to the window and sat until the glass fogged. I thought about the word family and how it used to mean a room where no one counted your worth before they made a place for you. I thought about the man who told me it would be easier this way. Then I knew what scared me more than loneliness. The house I built for them no longer had a door for me. I began to add I did it at the kitchen table with a cheap calculator and the porch light humming like an insect. I wrote numbers on an envelope first. Then on the back of one of Elaine's recipe cards when the envelope filled. The first loan to help with their down payment was $28,000. The bank manager shook my hand and called me a good father. I wanted Noah to turn the key to a door that did not stick. I paid the appraisal fee when the inspector took his clipboard and left. 2 months later, the water heater failed. I used a card I had kept for emergencies. In November, the furnace coughed once and died. I split the bill with my savings and a small loan from a friend who refused to take interest. There were the smaller things that hid between paychecks. A disposal that swallowed a spoon and never recovered. A dishwasher hose that slipped free and flooded the breakfast nook. A garage door spring that snapped at dawn. I drove over with a thermos and a socket set and did not take off my coat. I kept a separate list for the quiet gifts. The card for gas that Noah used when his commute stretched across the suburbs. The winter tires I bought because the Whitakers did not like the look of used ones. The pantry boxes I dropped off in February when the utilities ate the grocery money, and pride did not allow them to ask. I stacked the pasta behind almond flour so it would not be seen. I added the visible things because they were easier to count. The long table Laura wanted for holidays. I bought the boards from a man who kept his lumber under a tarp and told me which planks were quiet. I sanded until the grain felt like silk. I canceled a dentist appointment so I could afford the finish that would resist wine. They ran their hands along the edge and said it looked store-bought. There were the outings I could not join but still paid toward. A weekend at a lake house that was not a house but a brochure. I circled the total on my bank statement and wrote the word gift over it, so I would not forget who I was trying to be. I added the time. The hours before sunrise when I drove across town to be at their house before workmen arrived. The Saturdays when I changed out light switches so Laura could dim the room in stages that matched her mood. The Sundays when I stood in the yard and watched snow fall through light I could not afford to keep on. What I did not add at first were the things I sold. Elaine's piano bench that still held the shadow of her knees. The rod and reel Noah and I used on a brown river. The watch I had bought the year our business made it through a winter without a missed paycheck. I slid it across a counter and walked out with money that did not feel like pride. When the totals grew heavy enough to tilt the card, I added the cost of silence. The birthdays I spent on their porch waiting for the right moment to ring the bell. The holidays where I brought the turkey to the door and took the bones home alone. The afternoons when I sat in a parking lot and rehearsed a speech about respect. Then drove away because I was afraid my words would break something that could not be fixed. I added Elaine, not as a number, but as the thread that tied it all. She taught me to open my hand and to expect nothing back but the warmth of giving. After she died, I tried to spend what was left of my love like she would have wanted. I thought if I gave enough, the hole would close. It did not. One night, I opened the shoebox where I keep the last pieces of our life. Her ring in a cloth pouch. The note Noah wrote in 2nd grade. A receipt for a room in Ohio from a trip we took before he was born. I realized I had started to measure my worth the way a ledger does. In columns that never show the sound of a voice at the end of the table. I tried to remember the purchases that felt like joy and not like repairs. The day I bought Noah his first suit, and the tailor pinned the cuffs while I told jokes. The graduation trip where we split a sandwich because we had promised to save. The motel with the noisy heater that worked better if you hit it with your shoe. Those memories cost nothing, and yet they were the ones I kept paying for with everything else. When the math finally ended, the number lay there like a large stone. I pressed my palm on it as if I could grind it smaller. I had sent over $200,000 in cash and work, and things whose price did not fit on a receipt. I had given up vacations, a new roof for my own house, and the small chair in the corner of a bookstore where I used to sit. I closed the calculator and the card and turned off the porch light. The house felt honest in the dark. I washed the plate I had used for dinner. I dried it and set it down and listened to the quiet. It sounded like a life stretched thin and still holding. It sounded like love pretending to be a budget. Before I went to bed, I wrote one more line on the back of the card. It did not have a number. It said, "I have paid enough." I put the card away and slept for the first time in months. The sleep did not heal me. It told me the truth. I could not keep giving to a door that never opened when I knocked. The first real fight did not come from me. It came from her. Laura called on a Tuesday evening. Her voice already sharp before I said hello. She said the electric bill had jumped again and asked if I could cover it. I reminded her gently that I had just paid for the roof repair. There was a pause long enough for me to hear her breath. Then she said, "Don't make this harder. You know you owe it to Noah." Oh. The word crawled under my skin. I almost laughed, but the sound came out broken. I said I would think about it and hung up. That night I sat at the table with Elaine's photo and whispered that our boy had married a woman who measured love in invoices. A week later, at their house, the argument came alive. I was fixing the back door that stuck when Laura walked in. She folded her arms. "My parents are embarrassed," she said. "They don't understand why Noah still depends on you. In their world, fathers don't meddle. They let go." I straightened slowly. "Meddle," I repeated. Her eyes never blinked. "Yes. You keep stepping in, making him look weak. Real men stand on their own." I looked around the kitchen, the granite counters, the double oven, the new light fixture. Every piece carried my fingerprints. "I built this," I said. "I stood between these walls when they were still bare studs." She tilted her head like I had spoken in a language she did not need to learn. Her father entered then, coat over his arm. He smiled thinly and said, "Laura's right. Support is one thing. Dependency is another. You should learn the difference." I gripped the screwdriver in my hand so hard it left a mark in my palm. Noah came in last. Looking between us, he tried to defuse it. "Dad, please, let's not fight." But his voice wavered. He was no longer the boy who asked me to steady his bike. He was a man caught between two families. And I was the one being pushed to the edges. Laura pressed further. "You know, your meals are too heavy for the kind of gatherings we have now. My parents prefer lighter food, more refined conversation." She said refined like it meant clean, and everything else meant dirt. I answered slowly. "Because anger has teeth. That heavy food kept your husband alive when he was small. Those meals were how his mother showed love. You have no right to shame that." She smirked. "I'm not shaming. I'm stating facts. You belong to a different world. A smaller one." The room tilted then. Noah rubbed his face, refusing to meet my eyes. Her father shifted his weight, waiting for me to explode. But I did not. I set the screwdriver on the counter. I said, "If small means I remember where I come from, then I will stay small." Laura's voice rose, sharp and certain. "Then stay out of our lives when we say so." Silence filled the kitchen like water. My son still did not look at me. That silence cut deeper than her words. I felt something inside me fold and harden. I picked up my coat, buttoned it slow, and spoke low so only Noah would hear. "One day, you'll have to choose who taught you how to stand." Then I left. That night, in my own house, I replayed every word. I thought of the classes I skipped so I could work extra shifts. Of the nights Elaine rubbed my shoulders when I was too tired to lift my arms. I thought of Noah's face when he hit his first ball, when he drove his first car, when he married Laura. And then I thought of his silence today. That silence was the true betrayal. I did not scream or throw things. Instead, I wrote down everything I had paid. Every sacrifice. I needed proof. Not for them, but for me. I needed to remember I was not crazy. that my life had been given piece by piece to this family. And now they dared to say I did not belong. I slept poorly. When dawn came, I made coffee and stood at the window. The neighbor kids ran to the bus stop with laughter in their breath. I envied their innocence. I pressed my palm against the glass and whispered to Elaine again. He will see. I said, he will learn too late. The next call would not be about bills. It would be about me finally saying no. The next morning I did the smallest brave thing I could imagine. I made coffee, sat at the table with my notes, and called the bank. A woman named Grace answered and asked how she could help. I told her I needed to stop an automatic transfer that left my account on the 15th. She pulled up the record and read the amount back to me. I knew the numbers by heart. I said yes, that one, and asked her to cancel it today. She was quiet for a breath. Then she asked if everything was all right. I looked at Elaine's picture on the shelf and told the truth for the first time in years. Everything is finally going to be all right. She confirmed the cancellation and gave me a reference number. I wrote it on the margin of an old grocery list. I read it back to her twice. When I hung up, the kitchen felt larger. I set my phone in a drawer so it would stop asking for my attention. I gathered the papers that proved my generosity and also my fear. Bank statements, receipts with coffee rings, text messages that began with need. I put them in a manila envelope and slid it into the bottom of a file box. I did not need to look at them again to know what they meant. I had been trying to buy my place at a table my son no longer guarded. At lunch I made a simple sandwich and ate it by the back door. Snow lifted from the fence in quiet sheets. I thought about all the mornings I drove across town when something broke in their house. I thought about the word "oh" and how it had grown teeth. I had always believed a father owes love. I had never agreed that he owes silence when that love is exploited. By afternoon, I felt the tremor of old habits. My hands reached for the keys as if to drive over and fix something that might not even be broken. I put the keys back and sat with the discomfort. I told myself that real love sometimes requires a border. I told myself I could learn to hold the line without becoming stone. I took out the spare key to Noah's house. It was on a ring with the tiny flashlight he liked as a boy. I turned the key in my hand until the metal warmed. Then I set it in a small box near Elaine's letters. I was not cutting him off from my life. I was cutting him off from the version of me that crawled through their door whenever someone snapped their fingers. In the evening, I wrote a letter. I kept it short because long speeches can hide what needs to be said. I told my son I loved him. I told him I would not pay their bills anymore. I told him I would come when invited with respect and leave when ignored. I told him my door was open but my wallet was closed. I folded the letter and placed it by the kettle, so I would remember to mail it in the morning. I slept hard that night. No dreams. No stumbling awake to check the balance in my account. When I opened my eyes, the house felt honest again. I brewed coffee and stood at the window while the first light gathered over the street. A neighbor waved as he scraped ice from his windshield. I waved back and felt something within me lift like a bird that had been building strength in a quiet cage. Laura called just after 9. The phone lit the drawer like a lighthouse under water. I let it ring. She called again. Then again. I counted the chimes and did not move. After the third attempt, she sent a text that said, "This is urgent." I closed the drawer and went outside to shovel the walk. The snow was light and the work was clean. When I came back in, my body felt useful in a way money never makes you feel. At noon, Noah called. My hand moved toward the drawer before I could stop it. I stood in the hallway and listened to my son's voice on the message. He sounded tired. He sounded like a man reading a script he did not believe. He said they were behind and needed help to avoid late fees. He said it would be easier if I just covered this month and we could talk later. He said please at the end, soft as a boy asking for something small. I sat down and listened to the message again. Then I answered with a text so I would not start confessing old weakness on a call. I wrote that I loved him. I wrote that I could not keep paying. I wrote that I would help him find a plan if he wanted one. But I would not be his plan. Then I put the phone away before his reply could find me. I went for a walk through the old neighborhood where we taught Noah to ride a bicycle. I could still see the line of my own footsteps next to his, and the way he looked back to make sure I was there. At the corner, a dog barked. A child in a red hat waved from a porch. A woman carrying groceries nodded at me as if we had always known each other. It was ordinary, and it was holy. That evening, I made a pot of chili with Elaine's recipe. I set 2 bowls on the table out of habit, and then returned one to the cabinet. I ate slowly, and let the heat fill the spaces that had felt cold for a long time. After dishes, I sat by the window and watched the street lamps bloom. A light snow started again and softened the edges of the world. The phone in the drawer hummed like a trapped insect. More messages. More urgency. I pictured Laura reading the words she would use. Words about duty. Words about the image of family. Words about what I owed. I took a breath and let the noise pass through me. The house held steady around me. The clock clicked. The furnace exhaled. For the first time in years, I felt the quiet choose me back. Before bed, I opened my letter one more time to see if it was still honest. It was. I sealed it and set it by the door with my gloves. Then I turned off the lights and let the small rooms go dark. I told Elaine good night and asked her to keep me from small revenge. I did not need to punish anyone. I only needed to stop agreeing to my own disappearance. In the morning, I mailed the letter. The clerk stamped the envelope and smiled as if I had done something ordinary. Perhaps I had. On the way home, I bought fresh bulbs for the porch light and a small plant for the kitchen. I set the plant on the sill and watered it with a measuring cup so I would not drown it with sudden attention. I promised the plant that I would show up in small ways every day. That afternoon, Laura's father left a long voicemail that sounded like a speech at a club. He spoke about dignity and appearances and what people in their circle might think. He said some threats without using that word. I poured tea and let his voice finish without entering my body. Then I deleted it. I knew what came next. People who have fed on your yes will call your no a betrayal. They will not tolerate the quiet that follows. I sat back at the table as the day faded. I pressed my hand flat on the wood I had sanded 20 years ago. I understood that love is not a faucet someone else gets to open whenever they are thirsty. Love is a well you tend. And sometimes guarding it means closing the gate. My phone was still in the drawer. The plant looked happy on the sill. The porch light glowed sure and warm. I was not a bank. I was a father. I had said no. And beneath the ache there was a relief so deep it felt like sleep after a long storm. I knew there would be a price. I could already hear the first rumble of it from that other house. It would arrive as noise and story and outrage. It would tell me who they had always been. 3 days after I mailed the letter, my phone filled with messages from numbers I did not know. One said, "Wow." Another said, "Shame on you." A third was a link to a glossy local magazine called Oakwood Living. The headline sat on my screen. Local tradesman abandons elderly couple at airport during holiday rush. My name was in the first line. My photo too. The porch picture Noah once took. The story said I had agreed to pick up Laura's parents and never showed. It said travel was dangerous. It quoted an unnamed source who worried about my mental health and said, "Age can make people unreliable." They called me unreliable. They called me dangerous. By noon, the piece had migrated to a neighborhood moms group. Comments rolled. One said men like him should not be around children. Another claimed I left a pencil mark on a baseboard and never apologized. At the store, a cashier who used to ask about my knees rang me up without eye contact. I read the article 3 times. It used allegedly and concerned. It never said Laura's father had placed the call. It never said I had spent 5 years paying their bills. It left out everything that would make the picture whole. 2 clients canceled before lunch. A third wrote that his brand could not risk controversy. I sat at my kitchen table with a day suddenly empty and pressed my thumb into the wood until the sting beat back the shame. I drove to the river and watched gray water fold around rocks. I asked Elaine what to do when your name enters rooms you have never seen. She would have baked and spoken kindly. I could not. I would not perform apology for a lie. Before dinner, someone taped the article to my front door. The word abandons circled in red. I made tea and folded the page and set it under a salt shaker so it would stop catching my eye. I slept in scraps and woke to more tags. A man I built a deck for wrote that I showed up early and under budget. Strangers argued as if they knew me. At noon, Laura called. I let it ring to voicemail. She said her parents had been humiliated by the airport ordeal. She said I had refused a simple favor any decent family would do. She said people were watching and I should correct the record. She did not mention my letter. She did not mention the years of transfers that kept her lights on. An email arrived next from a neighborhood committee I had never heard of. It complained that my truck displayed tools. It warned me about community standards. A friend forwarded it with a note that said, "The Whitakers are telling people about the element you represent." Element. As if I were a spill. In the shop that evening, the cedar would not listen. Every cut went crooked. I sanded until a board turned thin and useless. I threw it into the scrap bin and sat on a stool and pressed my fists to my eyes like a boy who has fallen and does not want anyone to see him cry. Noah texted that this is getting out of control and that Laura says you should say something. I stared at his message until the words blurred. I wrote back one line. "I will not confess to the lie that protects your pride." He did not reply. The next day the story reached a radio show. They framed it with words like vulnerable and erratic. They flashed my photo next to a stock image of a snowbound runway. It had not snowed. The week had been dry and bright. Truth felt like a moth banging itself dumb against glass. At the hardware store, I felt the room quiet when I walked in. I still bought my screws. At the door, a woman touched my sleeve. My father put a roof over us with 2 hands and a ladder. She said, "Do not let them turn you into a monster." The words steadied me enough to reach my truck. That night I wrote a statement on paper. I wrote the date. I wrote the weather. I wrote that no one had asked me to drive to the airport. I wrote that I had ended the monthly transfer and did not owe an explanation to people who had never seen my statements. I wrote that love cannot live where respect is rationed. I ended with one line. "My name is mine. Please stop taking it." I called the magazine and asked for the editor. A young voice said they could add a note if new information emerged. He suggested a letter to the editor. I saw it already. Tucked under the headline that told people what to believe. They would skim it between soup recipes and tile ads. I thanked him and hung up. Late that night, a reporter called and asked if I had a comment about the allegations. Allegations. As if I had been charged. I said one sentence. "I will not be your content." I walked after dark and looked through lit windows at families bending over puzzles and shouting answers at the television. I felt like a man pressed against glass on the wrong side of his own life. When I got home, I sat under the window where Elaine kept a plant that never died and breathed until the room stopped spinning. Morning brought one clear thought. If they wanted a stage, I would build one where truth could stand. Not with rage. Not with rumor. With receipts and dates and the steady voice that saw Noah through fevers in the night. I would not fight in their room. I would invite the people who mattered into mine, and no one would leave confused about who I had been and who I refused to be now. I began the work the way I once began a deck, measuring twice. Cutting once. Making sure each piece fit where it should. This was not lumber. Though. This was the weight of 5 years stacked in neat order. I pulled down the old file box from the closet shelf. Inside were bank statements, contracts, receipts crumpled into the corners. I spread them across my kitchen table until the wood disappeared. The papers looked like a map of my mistakes. And for the first time, I was ready to follow it all the way to the end. I highlighted every transfer. Every month, the money drained from me into their account. Yuan. 451 month. Yuan. 800 the next. The ink glowed yellow under the lamp, bright as warning lights. I taped each year into rows. The columns of numbers stared back at me. Proof that I had been paying rent on my own exile. I gathered the receipts Laura had texted about new flooring. A chandelier. Stainless steel appliances. I remembered each conversation. It's just for the house value, she had said. It's an investment in the future. My future never walked through that front door. But the bills did. Next, I dug out the old phone. The one I used before I learned to delete messages. It still held the thread of Laura's voice asking for favors. The water bill is late again. The credit card is maxed out. Can you cover groceries? My parents are visiting. Can you help with new linens? My handwriting was slow, careful, almost reverent. Each page became an indictment, but also a rescue. With every entry, I took back the truth they had tried to bury under shame. I printed screenshots of their social media posts, Laura showing off the new backyard furniture I bought. Noah smiling beside a car he swore was leased with his own bonus. The comments were full of praise. What a beautiful life you've built. They never corrected anyone. Why would they? My silence had been the best foundation they could ask for. On the counter I stacked 12 folders. One for each guest they had invited to Thanksgiving. I slipped evidence into each folder. A screenshot. A receipt. I wanted every set of eyes in that dining room to see the cost of the performance they had been applauding. At night I rehearsed what I might say. I tried different versions in front of the bathroom mirror. Sometimes my voice cracked. Sometimes it thundered. But in every version I ended with the same line. Respect is not something you buy with someone else's money. Fear lived in me. Of course, fear that Noah would hate me forever. That Laura would spin my truth into another lie. That their friends would look at me and still choose them. But fear was not enough to stop me. I had already lived 5 years in a cage built from my own obedience. A man cannot stay there without losing what makes him a father. I remembered the day Elaine brought Noah home from the hospital. She placed him in my arms and whispered, "Protect him, even from himself." For years I thought that meant shielding him from pain. Now I knew it meant protecting the part of him that still knew who he was before pride swallowed him whole. So I sharpened my evidence the way I once sharpened chisels. I made sure the dates lined up. The amounts were exact. The lies exposed. I was not planning a scene. I was preparing a trial. On the last night before the holiday, I laid the 12 folders in a row on the counter. I looked at them the way a carpenter looks at beams before a roof goes up. Strong enough to hold. Straight enough to show the shape of what had always been hidden. I poured a glass of water, steadying my hand against the counter. The quiet of the house wrapped around me. I could almost hear Elaine's voice. Low and steady. Do it with dignity. Do it with truth. That's enough. When I turned off the kitchen light, the folders gleamed faintly in the moonlight, like silent witnesses waiting to be called. The street was full by the time I parked 2 houses down. Warm light poured from their windows. Laughter drifted into the cold. I sat with my hands on the wheel until the shaking stopped. Then I lifted the briefcase and crossed the lawn. The door opened before I could knock. A guest stepped past me with a pie and did not ask who I was. I entered quietly and followed the sound of voices. The dining room glowed. 12 places set in a careful circle. Crystal water glasses. Linen napkins folded like small boats. Laura saw me first. Her smile froze. Noah stood up so fast his chair tipped. He caught it with a hand that used to catch baseballs. He said my name like a question and a warning at once. I set the briefcase on the sideboard and opened the latches. The click sounded like something final. I looked around the table and found my voice. Good evening. I will not stay long. I brought something you deserve to see. Laura stepped forward. You need to leave. There are guests. This is a private dinner. I kept my eyes on her but spoke to the room. I am a father. I am not a rumor. What you have heard about me is missing the part where I paid for the roof over your heads. I handed the first folder to the woman closest to me. Then I moved clockwise. One for each place. Bank statements on top. Screenshots under that. Receipts at the back. 12 stacks. 12 chances to see what respect costs when it is not shared. A man in a blue suit opened his packet and frowned at the yellow lines over the numbers. He looked up at Laura. These are transfers from his account. Monthly. 5 years. Another guest turned a page and stared at my notes in the margin. Chandelier. Oven. Flooring. Her eyes lifted to the light above the table and then back to the paper. She did not speak. Laura reached for a stack as if she could pull them all back at once. I held her gaze and did not move. I said one sentence. Let your friends read. Noah took a packet with shaking hands. He studied the first page and then the third. He asked me if the total was real. My voice came out steady. Yes. Laura's mother recovered first. She smiled the way people do when they want everyone to sit down and be reasonable. She said this is a misunderstanding. Families help one another. It is not unusual. I nodded. It is not unusual to help. It is unusual to ban the man who helped from the holiday table. It is unusual to call a magazine and paint him as someone who abandons the elderly. It is unusual to say he is unstable when he finally says no. Heads moved. Not a lot. Enough to tell me the words were landing where they should. Laura's father stood. He kept his voice calm. You are upset. You are making a scene. Think about how this looks. I faced him. I am not here to look any kind of way. I am here to tell the truth with paper in a room that prefers perfume. I am here to take my name back from your mouth. The room went still. A fork slipped and touched the plate with a nervous ring. A woman at the far end flipped to the last page. The magazine article. My notes in red. She read the weather for that day out loud. Clear sky. 46 degrees. She looked at Laura. There was no storm. Laura stammered, that memory is imperfect, that emotions run high, that this was all very unfortunate. She reached for Noah's arm. He pulled back and kept reading. He paused at a screenshot. It showed a weekend at the lake with a caption about hard work paying off. My note under it said the dates. The dates matched a mortgage payment and a charge for new tires and a grocery order that I had covered. He swallowed hard. Dad, he said, did you pay for the tires too? Yes. His face went white. He looked at Laura like a man waking up in a room he did not choose. He asked her if she had known the total. She said the total is not the point. He said it had always been the point. Laura's father reached for the article and spoke of reputation. He warned me that slander has consequences. I pointed to the printed piece. It carried his quotes and his timeline. I said, slander. Wears a tuxedo in this town. It still stinks. The guest in the blue suit set his packet down with care. He looked at Laura and then at Noah. He said, I believed things that were not true. He turned to me. Sir, I am sorry. I did not know. Across the table, a neighbor with kind eyes pressed her napkin to her mouth. She whispered that her father built houses and taught her to keep promises. She said the number on those pages felt like betrayal and not like family. Laura tried one more tactic. She moved to the head of the table and raised her hand for silence. She said, this is private. She said, this is unkind. She said, I am making a holiday ugly. I did not raise my voice. I said I mailed a letter. I ended the transfer. I spoke to them first. The article made it public. I am only giving the public the missing pages. Noah stood. He closed his folder and looked around at the faces he had invited. He spoke as if a wire inside him had snapped. My father paid for this house when I could not. He kept us warm when I was too proud to say I was cold. He was not invited tonight because I wanted to keep the peace. He looked at Laura. I see what that peace cost. Her lips trembled. She reached for him. He stepped away. A whisper moved around the room like a draft. Chairs scraped. A guest rose and put on his coat. Another collected her purse. People who had come to admire a table now stared at its legs and wondered what held it up. Laura's mother accused me of sabotage. I shook my head. Sabotage is secret. This is light. Light does not break a thing that is honest. It only shows the crack already there. I closed the briefcase and slid one last folder toward the sideboard. It held a copy of my letter. It held my promise and my boundary. I told Noah I loved him. I said I would not bankroll disrespect again. He nodded once. His eyes shone, but the tears did not fall. He had a choice to make, and he knew it. I did not ask him to make it there. I turned to leave. No one tried to stop me. The room began to murmur. Voices tangled. China whispered against China. A social life bent under the weight of a truth it had never planned to carry. At the door I paused and looked back. I saw my son standing alone at the end of a long table. I saw Laura's hands hover and then drop. I saw a future break and another one start to breathe. Outside, the air felt new and clean. I walked to the truck with my coat open. I drove the slow way home past the field where Noah learned to catch. The lights along the fence were small and sure. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a long time in the quiet. I did not feel vindicated. I felt honest. Sometimes honest is the only victory a father can claim without losing himself. I went inside and turned on the porch light. I set the briefcase under the bed. I poured a glass of water and held it with 2 hands. The house hummed. The night did not bite. In one home, a party was ending. In mine, a promise had finally taken root. The fallout came fast. Invitations dried up. The couple who hosted wine nights sent a note that said they needed space. A neighbor who once borrowed my ladder crossed the street rather than pass my porch. The magazine never printed a correction. It did not need to. The truth had slipped into the only room that mattered. People who had clapped for Laura's performance now stared at the floor and excused themselves early. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at their house with a window in the envelope and a warning at the top. Final notice. I know because Noah brought it to me. Unopened. The crease still clean where he had pressed it flat with his thumb. He stood on my step with his coat unbuttoned and a face I had not seen since the year he learned to tie his shoes. Older. Scared. Trying to be brave. I made tea because hands need something to do when the heart is breaking. We sat at the table. He passed me the envelope. I slid the paper out and read the numbers. 3 months behind. 14 days to cure. A line about legal action. The words were dry and exact. They always are. They carry no memory of birthdays or the smell of soap on a boy who has fallen asleep in a truck after a late game. Dad, he said softly. I have been an idiot. I nodded once. I did not hurry to fill the quiet. He looked at the window where the porch light made a small circle on the snow. He said, Laura told me the article was a nudge to teach you a lesson. She said it would be contained. She said her father knew people who could protect us. She said a lot of things. I let her. He cried then. Not loud, not dramatic. The way a man does when he has run out of lies to tell himself. He said, I am sorry, until the words felt thin. And then he said the real thing. I chose their approval over your dignity. I chose comfort over truth. I chose peace that cost your place in my life. I am so sorry. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. It was like touching the hand of a boy who once grabbed my sleeve at the top of the slide and asked me to wait. I said, "I forgive you." The words were true. Forgiveness always arrived faster than I expected when it was my son. But forgiveness is not a time machine. It does not return what years have taken. It does not write checks. He asked the question without eye contact. "Is there any way you can help us make it current?" I did not look away. I said no. It was the hardest no of my life and the cleanest. I told him I would help him pack if it came to that. I told him I would drive the truck. I told him I would sit with him at the bank and ask about options. I told him I would stand beside him when he called the agent to list the house. I would help with everything that builds a life. I would not fund the lesson that had already arrived. He nodded. The nod told me he had expected the answer and that a part of him was relieved. He said, "I think we should sell." I said, "I think you should." He laughed once without joy and said, "Laura will fight me." I said, "Then you will have to decide what you are willing to lose in order to keep what cannot be replaced." He took a breath that sounded like a man surfacing from deep water. He said, "There is something else." I swallowed. He said, "The night you came to dinner, I felt proud of you. I also felt ashamed because I let it get that far. I should have stopped it the first time they mocked you. I should have told them that the man who built my life gets a seat at any table I sit at." He stared at his hands. "I was a coward. You were a son who forgot his story." I said, "Pride will do that. Shame will do it too. You remember now. That is where the work starts." He reached into his pocket and set a key on the table. It was the spare to their house with the tiny flashlight he loved as a boy. I had taken it off my ring the day I learned how far gone we were. He pushed it toward me, then stopped halfway. "Keep it," he said. "Not as a ticket, as a sign that the door is open when we do this right." I did not take the key. Not yet. I slid a small box from the shelf and opened it. Inside lay my spare to his first apartment, the one I kept long after he moved. I set the box between us. I said, "Keys matter less than the rules of the house. Here are mine. If you want me there, say my name with respect. If someone speaks small about where I come from, stop them. If you need help, ask early and tell the truth. If you want money, you will not get it. If you want a father, you have one." He nodded again. His face changed in the way faces do when a boy returns to his bones. He looked older and younger at once. He asked if he could stay for dinner. I said yes. I heated chili and buttered 2 slices of bread. We ate at the little table Elaine loved. He asked for the recipe. I told him to open the drawer and read the card with her handwriting that climbs uphill like hope. He ran his finger along her name as if touching a rail that could hold him. After dishes, he called the bank from my phone so I could hear his voice steady. He asked about selling before the deadline. He wrote notes in a clean notebook. He said thank you after every answer. When he hung up, he looked 10 pounds lighter. We talked about small things then. The way the fence creaks in a thaw. The neighbor boy who plays drums at noon. The dog that has learned the mail route. Every ordinary thing sounded like a song played on an instrument we had not touched in years. He stood to go. The porch light made his breath a white ribbon. At the door, he turned back. He said, "I will fix this." I said, "You will not fix it alone." He hugged me the way men do when they are trying not to cry again. When he stepped into the night, I felt the house adjust around the place he had occupied, and then hold steady. A message came later. He had told Laura that the house would be sold. He had told her the bank had a date. He had told her there would be no more articles. He wrote that he would bring a box on Saturday, and we would start with the room that had the most of my work in it. He wrote that he understood if I did not want to come. I wrote back that I would be there at 9 with donuts and a drill. I turned off the lights and stood a long time in the dark. The night felt honest. I touched the photo of Elaine and told her our boy had come home in the way that matters, not to stay forever. to learn how to stand without stepping on my back. The house breathed. The clock spoke. Somewhere a car door closed and a dog returned to its bed. I slept with the window cracked and the porch light humming, grateful for a future that did not need to be perfect to be true. Spring arrived like an apology. Meltwater traced thin lines along the curb, and the maple by my porch pushed out green. I oiled Elaine's bench and waited for Noah's truck. He came with boxes and a face that had learned to tell the truth. We worked without speeches. We wrapped the small things I had made and they had forgotten to thank. A spice rack with brass screws. A lemon-scented drawer tray. The first frame I carved when he got hired. He touched that frame the way a man touches a door he once slammed. We shut off the breaker and took down the chandelier. Noah held the wires and whispered, "I thought this was how we became bigger. Sometimes bigger is only farther from home," I said. He handed me a wire nut. We finished in clean silence. At noon, we ate sandwiches at the little table, with the maple in the window. He asked for the recipe cards. I gave him all of them. He folded them like passports. He said he had told Laura the house would go. He did not hate her. He hated the bargain he made to feel tall. The listing posted. At closing, he signed until his name looked like a prayer that had forgotten where to end. After, we stood at the river where water shouldered past stone. "What now?" he asked. "Fix what I postponed," I said. "Plant tomatoes and give them away with my name on the bag. Keep a chair on Sundays for anyone who wants to tell the truth. Will you come to dinner when I find a small place?" he asked. "I will bring bread," I said. He laughed through his nose like he did at 10 when the world turned from threat to road. On the last day, we locked the door and he set the key in my palm. "Keep it," he said. "Not for this house. For whatever comes next." I closed my fingers around the weight we had carried. Love, debt, anger, apology, light, and slipped it in my pocket. We walked to the truck like men who had set down something heavy and were ready to pick up what matters. That night I sat on the porch with a new bulb. I raised a glass of water and thanked Elaine for teaching me to give. And to stop. I watched the light and remembered what it meant when Noah was small. This home is open. There is room if you come with respect. There is bread if you are hungry. There is a chair if you want to try again. Near morning rain moved across the roof in a patient hush. I woke to a day that wanted me. I wrote a list titled "Work for My Own House" and smiled. The future waited like a clean board. I drew the first true line I had made for myself in years.